we need to start with prayer. We need to start with, then we'll do review. So anything we need to pray for this morning before we jump in. I know Janet's taking it easy today, so still pray for her breathing. Yeah. So we will do that. Anything else?
I have a granddaughter. She and her husband are moving back here from a year in Virginia in June. And she's coming later in April to do some concentrated house hunting. And it may take prayer to the house.
It will take prayer. It will, yeah, that's not an easy thing, is it? No. Okay. So we will pray for them. I know that's not easy.
And then if they don't get a house, they may be living with me and son.
So prayers for you, right? Because that's a lot of fun to have unexpected, not unexpected, but house guests for a while. Anything else? Okay, let's go ahead and pray, and then we will start with review. God, thank you so much for your faithfulness to us. Thank you so much for bringing us together to study your word. I know there are some among us traveling and taking care of family business and things going on in their life. God, we just pray for them for safety and for peace and for the things that they're working on to come together. God, we lift up to you Janet this morning. I know she's been having some more troubles with her breathing, and we just pray that you will just clear her airways, help her to rest. I know she is a woman who does not like to stop, but God, would you just be with her and just heal those lungs? We know that she wishes she was here today and able to be with family and friends and do all the fun things, but God, help her to rest. We lift up to you Patsy's granddaughter and her husband as they get ready to move to town and begin to look at houses, that you would just provide the perfect house for them and peace in the process, God. We thank you so much for how you are concerned with even what seem like small and sometimes big details of our life, God. You are concerned with them all. Help us walk in truth today. Help us to handle your word correctly. And more than anything, God, soften our hearts and show us ways in which maybe we need to make a shift in thought or in behavior to line up more with your word, God. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, so I told Blake she missed the sex talk last week. Marriage, divorce, and remarriage. So maybe some of the other, I'm sure a couple others of you also missed that. It was a fun week. So go back and watch it if you want to have some fun. Now we're going to move on to something a little bit different. We're moving on to just chapter 8 and 9, a big change, but it matches the way that 1 Corinthians was put together. Paul did not intend to write a letter all about one subject, right? Why did Paul write the letter of 1 Corinthians? Let's do review that way. Why did he write it? There were problems, right? So he's answering questions they had, and he's addressing issues that he's heard about. And we talked about that. Those first 6 chapters are the things that he heard about, like divisions in the church and a case of pretty horrific immorality, right? And then the second half, which is where we're at, are the questions that they had. Now, we've looked at the question from chapter 7. So what do we think the question was that he was addressing in chapter 7?
That was last week.
That was last week. Blanche gets a pass. Blanche gets a pass.
Somebody has to speak up.
So what were, I mean, generally,
Marriage
what
and
was,
singleness.
say again, Lindy?
Marriage and singleness.
Marriage and singleness. When we talked our way through it, it seems that what was their theory about marriage and singleness? What maybe was going on in the church as far as marriage and singleness was concerned? There was a lot going on. Remember, this is a young church. Most of the people had come to Christ as adults. Some as Jews, some as idol worshipers, right? And so what were some of the situations they were running into with marriage and singleness?
Some have an unbelieving spouse.
Did you have an unbelieving spouse? And so Paul said, if you have an unbelieving spouse, if they're willing to stay, they need to let them stay. If they need to leave the marriage, let them leave the marriage. That was one situation. What else was a situation? How about singleness? What was their question about singleness? Well, yes, it had to do with that, but what else? Remember, they were...
Divorce versus remarriage.
Yeah, right. If they divorced, should they remarry, right? A lot of should I get married questions, right? If I'm single, whether because I've been previously divorced or whether because I've never been married. For some parents, my children are not yet married. Should we let them get married? Remember, there was this thinking that if sex in their city was tied to immorality, should they as a church then become super holy by not having sex? So that's true, but so their question was, if I'm single, shouldn't I stay single because then I'm not having sex and I'm super holy? Right? I mean, Catholic Church has taken that and run, right? Some other churches have taken that and run. And what was Paul's answer about that? If they want to get married, get married. It's not a sin to get married. Hallelujah, right? But what is his view on singleness? That's good, but he even takes it one step further. It's not just good. To be single is better. Why? Easier. I like your word, easier. You're not trying to please a spouse and God. You're not trying to care for your family and also spread the gospel. So he said to be single is easier. It's a better state he used. However, it's not a sin to go ahead and get married. So that was some of the things from chapter 7. So they had questions about marriage, divorce, remarriage, being single. So now we move on to chapter 8 and 9, right? So chapter 8 and 9, Blanche said it. Blanche, we came in and I said, we're going to talk about something completely different. And Blanche said, yes, we're going to talk about eating today. Right? We're talking about eating. So we're talking about what about eating? Carbs, no carbs. Yeah. What are we saying about eating? What's the question about eating?
Sacrificial food.
Sacrificial food. So, again, it's interesting, 7 was this way, 8 and 9 and 10 is this way. It's a church saying, we're living in the context of a society, of a city, that does something with food. What did that city oftentimes do with their food? Offered it to idols. So, one place that I read said, if you took, let's say you butchered a sheep, and you took it to the temple, a third of it was used to actually literally burn to that god. Let me make sure I get this right. A third was used to give to the priests, right? And a third you took home. So a third you gave to the idol, a third you took home to eat for you and your family, and a third was given to the priest. The priest couldn't possibly eat all that food. So a lot of times what they chose to do was either give it to the restaurant that was connected, a lot of restaurants were connected to temples. So either give it that or sell it in the market and make money. So this is a church asking the question, should we go to restaurants that are connected to the temple because then our food has been dedicated to an idol? Can we buy our food in a market where we think that it's been dedicated to an idol? So that's the question that Paul is dealing with. And by the way, he's not the first person to deal with it. He looked at it in Acts, right? Early in the church history, there was a group of Christians asking very similar questions. We're not going to hit that right now, but we will in a minute. Okay, so let's start with 1 Corinthians 8, verses 1 to 3. Listen for 2 words that are, I think, contrasted. They're also compared, but they're mostly contrasted in verses 1 to 3 of 1 Corinthians 8. So here we go. Now concerning things sacrificed to idols. We know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge makes arrogant, but love edifies. If anyone supposes that he knows anything, he has not yet known as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by him. Therefore, concerning the eating of things sacrificed to idols, we know that there is no such thing as an idol in the world, and that there is no God but one. Okay. 2 words, contrasted. Then it's the basis of his entire argument and the answer. So we need to get this under our belt first. What are the 2 things?
No idol and God is one.
Okay, there's no idols and God is one, yes. But so let's tie that to another word, and it's a word that you marked it, right? Knowledge and love. So you talked about what we need to know, Blanche. So you had that. So we have knowledge and we have love. Both of these things are motivators to your behavior, right? Sometimes you're motivated by knowledge, right? And sometimes you're motivated by love. So sometimes there are things that you know, so you choose to do it. How about the speed limit on the road? I know the speed limit's 35, but you know what I also know? That a policeman's probably not gonna pull me over if I'm doing about 5 over. So I make a decision, my behavior is based on knowledge. I can go 40 and 35, right? Or my behavior can be motivated by love. I love the people in my neighborhood, and I don't want to speed because maybe I'll hurt them. So I can be motivated by knowledge, or I can be motivated by love. This is the premise of where Paul's going to go. So before we go much further, let's talk about, let's start with verse 1, and let's list things about knowledge. Okay, verse 1 says knowledge does what?
Arrogant.
So it makes a person arrogant. He just right off the bat is going to say, listen, making all your decisions and knowledge can make a person arrogant. But love does what? Smooths it out. The other word is, if those of you the NASB, edifies. What does it mean to edify? Smooth out. Thank you, Blanche. It builds up. It literally builds up. It fortifies something. It edifies something. It builds something up. So he's already contrasting. So based on that statement, where do you think Paul's going to go? Which one is more desirable when you're talking about food sacrifice to idols? Knowledge or love? So, okay, so you guys are smart. You already did your homework, so you know the answer. Okay, but there's that. Now, let's look at verse 2. He goes back and he's talking about knowledge, and he makes a statement. What did he say in verse 2? He says, just say, if you're sitting in this church and you think that you know everything. That's how we start the sentence, right? What does he say? You're arrogant and you don't really what? You don't know anything. Okay, so if you think you know everything, you don't.
No, that would be dangerous.
Well, there's truth there. I think in a way, he takes the statement and he kind of, and Paul has a habit of doing this. He makes it a little more grandiose than he is, but he said, basically, one of the things I said, you really know nothing. Okay. So again, he's building the case against acting just purely in knowledge. Okay, so if you think you know everything, you really know nothing. Okay, verse 3. Now we have the contrast. However, on the right-hand side of our chart, what do you learn about love? If you what? If you love God, what? Right? Okay. Right? They should. You know, you saw it at the beginning of your lesson. They wrote that in your lesson. Like how many problems in the church, how much more effective could we have been in the church if we really understood the deep truths of these chapters? They're not easy to grasp right at just a quick reading. You really have to dig. But you're right, Blanche. I mean, we're living in times, they lived in times they needed it. We're living in times where we still need it. Okay, so if anyone loves God, he is known by him. Now, verse 4. He's like, concerning your issue, based on this truth, what you know and then how you love, right? What you love, what you know. He said, verse 4, what is the truth? He said, it has to do with knowledge. He's like, we know something about idols, generally speaking. Okay, We know idols are make-believe. I mean, they're things, they're statues, but they're nothing, right? So he's like, he's talking to a church that says, but I know better. I can go buy that meat that was sacrificed to whoever, and I can eat it in the house without fear or concern, because the thing it was dedicated to is make-believe. Nothing about this meat has really changed. I can eat it and be fine. A whole bunch of people were thinking that way. And Paul is saying, you're right. Your knowledge is right. Now, we Americans, we hear your knowledge is right, and we run with it, right? Right? Our answer for everything is if you educate people and let them know the truth, they're going to do the right thing. Has that panned out? We educate people about drugs and premarital sex and AIDS and how it spreads and crime and everything else. We educate, educate, educate. Does it change behavior always? Does it change? No. Okay. So, but you can know something is true, and there's nothing wrong with that. Okay. So, he says that in verse 4. He knows what is true about idols is there's no such thing as an idol. So, we know idols are not real. Okay. But it doesn't stop there. That's what I just said. You can't just say, okay, problem solved. Tell the church. There's just no real things as idols. Again, this is a church with people that are coming to Christ on a weekly, daily basis, and everybody grows at a different rate, right? Everybody has a different life experience. It's not as simple as this in the church. And so, let's see what he has to say. Let's look at verses 5 and 6. Okay, he's going to continue on with this thought that there's no such thing as an idol in the world. Verse 5, he says, for even if there are so-called gods, okay, just say there are, right? Devil's advocate. There are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords. Yet for us, this is something else to know, there's only what? One God, the Father, from whom are all things, and we exist for him, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, by whom are all things, and we exist through him. So, verse 5, what is he saying there?
There are idols.
Yeah, there are idols. So someone could come and say, okay, but I'm afraid there really are other gods. He's like, okay, just say you think that. What is actually still true, though? It's the whole second half of chapters of verse 6. God's only one God, and all things come what? Through him, and then he has his son, Jesus Christ, and all things are, I'm going to make sure I get this right. Sometimes I get confused. Yes, so one God, we exist for him, Jesus Christ, we exist through him. He's like, okay, someone in your church is afraid that those idols might really be real. Okay, but what you need to remember is there's one true God, right?
Absolutely.
Right. Okay, so that's very knowledge-based, right? This is the knowledge. Okay, I need to add that. We know there's one true God. We know there, I'm going to make sure I get this right. There is one God, the Father, and one Lord, Jesus. By the way, we're not too far from living in a society that believes Caesar was a god or a lord. I think there's a little bit of a reference to that. I mean, they lived in a place where it's like you worshiped him, and he's like, okay, you're right. People do worship him as a lord. People do worship a god, but what we need to know is this. There's one God the Father and one Lord Jesus. Okay, so these are the things to know. So, Paul is already setting the groundwork. Here's what we know. No such thing as idols, and one God and Father, and Jesus Christ, right? The things that they need to know. Still doesn't solve the problem entirely. Okay, let's look at verses 7 to 13. I'm going to read it. Read out the rest of the chapter and then ask yourself, okay, this obviously doesn't take care of it. Listen for what are the other issues going on. Verse 7, however, not all men have this knowledge. What knowledge? What I just wrote on the board. But some, being accustomed until the idol until now, eat food as if it were sacrificed to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. But food will not commend us to God. We are neither the worse if we do not eat, nor the better if we do eat. But take care lest this liberty of yours somehow becomes a stumbling block to the weak. For if someone sees you who have knowledge dining in an idol's temple, will not his conscience, if he is weak, be strengthened to eat things sacrificed to idols? For through your knowledge he who is weak is ruined, the brother for whose sake Christ died. And thus by sinning against the brethren and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again, that I might not cause my brother to stumble. So go back to verse 7. Right. I love cauliflower, Kathy. I've never given it up.
I think he became a vegan.
I mean, when he needed to, right? So go back to verse 7. This is the true knowledge, right? This is right and true. A lot of people got these things. However, according to verse 7, what does he say? However, some people aren't here. And I would add, you going up to them and telling them that this is truth over and over and over isn't doing it right now.
They bring their past.
Thank you. Thank you. And he says it, verse 7, he's right. Being accustomed to the idol until when? Now. So imagine you're 60 years old and you've grown up worshiping idols in your house, and you come to Christ, but the other people in your house do. You can't just have someone come up and go, well, here's what we know. Change. It's just not that simple, right? Okay, so he's like, that's the problem. Not everybody has that. And he uses a phrase, he talks about their conscience. And he says their conscience is what? Their conscience is weak. Weak. Weak as in what? How do you read that?
Not being able to determine.
Yeah.
It's unconscious feelings and knowledge
It just,
that are left behind.
maybe not as developed, right? They're not dumb. They haven't grown yet. Right, right. So we understand that. We've been around people like that before in our lives. Okay, so the problem is if this weaker brother whose consciousness regarding idols is not yet developed, they do not have the same strength of conviction as someone else does. So can you see the problem that's unfolding? What happens when they walk in and see you eating meat or see you dining in the temple restaurant? What does Paul say? What happens to them?
They think they're not to the idol. Because that's what everybody else does.
Okay, yeah, so there's a lot of nuance to this, right? A, they see you, and what happens then?
I say, oh, look, they do it, I can do it.
They do it like I can do it too, right? And so maybe they go back to the past and think they're becoming, what do we call it? It's syncretism. It can cause, so syncretism is when you take idol worship and worship of Christ and you try to bring it together. So there could be some of that going on. Someone says, oh, I see Dan McCann, he's eating, here. Oh, he must worship idols a little bit in the side too. So it's okay. I don't really have to give all this up, right? There can be that. What else can happen?
But you can also have growth through that. You can see that and see that it's not helping them in it, and that maybe I do need to change my attitude. I can change.
Yes, he is not saying that that weak brother cannot be strengthened. He's not saying that at all, but he is saying, let's go on, because he's gonna say it, right? Verse 8, let's get this under our belt. Verse 8 says something about food. Oh, thank goodness. It's something else to know. I don't have any room here on knowledge, but it's something else to know, right? What does he say? Food can't do what? It can't commend us to God. What does that mean? Oh, here we go. We are neither the worse if we do not eat, nor the better if we do eat. Commend. What does that mean?
God doesn't look at the food you eat and say, yeah, you're holy.
He doesn't so much judge me based on what I eat and don't eat. That doesn't affect my salvation. That word commend is a little bit like this word know. It doesn't bring you closer to him.
Yeah, so if you're a vegan, you're not close to the meat that eats meat, okay?
Well, it's just, it's like it doesn't matter what you eat. Now again, think about if you're a Jew,
Yeah.
right? That's going to blow your mind, because if you're a Jew, you came from a tradition that said if I eat pork, actually God's going to spit me out, right? And now you just told me that if I eat pork, it doesn't matter. He says it's neither the worse nor the better if we eat. Now look at verse 9. It starts with the word but. So you can have this knowledge, more knowledge, that food doesn't matter with my salvation, right? But here's the warning. Take care, lest this liberty, another word for liberty, freedom, right? Lest this liberty of yours somehow does what?
Corruption.
Huh?
Corruption.
Okay, there's that. What else? What other verse say? A stumbling block to whom? Okay, so we're bringing in that weak person again. By the way, who is Paul mostly addressing here? The strong or the weak? The strong's being addressed. Those of us in the room that have this knowledge and have that freedom and understand all these things, he's not giving a lecture to the weak on how they need to get strong and get over it. He's talking to the strong. So keep that in mind. So he's saying, strong, you have liberty, you have freedom. You know you can eat anything. You can go eat in a temple restaurant and you can eat meat sacrificed to idols. You can buy it all. By the way, it was probably good to buy your meat from the priest because it's probably cheaper. So go ahead, save your money. However, Paul says, I draw the line, or I want you to consider not indulging your liberty, right? When it does what?
Causes somebody else's stuff.
And specifically who? So a Christian who just doesn't have your same conviction. So, wow.
This goes further than just meat.
It does. You're right. But we're going to get this under our belt first, but you were absolutely right. It does go way further than me. Okay, so verse 10, he plays it out again. For someone sees you, the stronger brother, you have the right knowledge, dining, will not that weaker brother, if he's weak, be strengthened to eat things sacrificed to idols? I think that's what brings in that syncretism. They're going to start riding the fence maybe, because they saw you there. Now listen, verse 11, for through your knowledge, you have all these things. You know these things, right? You're correct in your knowledge. For through your knowledge, he who is weak is then what? Whoa. Yeah. And then he goes ahead and throws on for extra, the brother for whose sake who died. That hurts. So the person to whom Christ gave his life, your liberty, because you're walking around going, I have knowledge. Doesn't bother me any, it doesn't hurt me any, but who did it hurt? Someone for whom Christ died, someone who was on their faith journey, and he's like, you have the ability to ruin them. Verse 12, and then he calls that strong person's action, verse 4. You've actually done what? Sinned. Against whom? Your brother, and you sin against, what is the last word of Christ? Ouch. Okay, verse 13. Therefore, Paul's conclusion is what? I'm not going to eat it. I'll become a vegan. So Paul said.
It just says don't be a hypocrite.
Well, I think even more specifically, Paul's saying, I will give up my freedom.
Yes.
I will make my life more difficult. I will not eat the food that I like. I will not engage in behavior that I enjoy, simply because I do not want my weaker brother to stumble. Because he considers it sin when he knowingly does such a thing. Okay, so let's tie love in. So for Paul, you can have all this knowledge, and he doesn't throw this word out a lot, but he is in the next chapter. What is the loving thing to do? Don't do what?
What causes somebody else to stumble?
Yeah. How about don't indulge your liberty your liberty that causes your brother to stumble. Go ahead.
I think Paul here is not saying that eating meat is sinful.
Nope.
He's
You are
saying
right.
that word you have at the beginning, the arrogance that you say you can do it, is what is sin.
Yes, I like that. Thank you for taking us back. Knowledge can make you arrogant, and so yes, I like that. My dad just tied arrogance to the idea that you go around and eat and do whatever you want without concern for a weaker brother. He would say that's arrogance.
That's the sin. Not the fact you're eating meat, but
Right.
that you're arrogant.
Right. I'm with you there. I trapped there. What truth does Paul want them to remember? So in chapter 8, what truth does Paul want them to remember?
Love your neighbor and don't cause them to be.
So love your neighbor, don't cause them to stumble. Is that what you're trying to say there? Okay. What else? Be a good example.
Show love.
How about, what does he want them to know about knowledge? Right.
No lot worse off if we do eat. No lot better off if we do.
Right? So he wants, yeah. So that's something else to know. What else does he want them to consider? Think about knowledge and love. What's a nice summary of knowledge and love? Can you, in your mind, formulate a sentence about knowledge and love that has to do with this chapter?
We have the knowledge.
Thank you.
We have the knowledge. It's what to do with it.
I like that. I'm going to start that.
It has to do with compassion.
Keep going, Kathy. So you can have,
You can have the knowledge.
uh-huh,
And you know what to do with the knowledge.
uh-huh.
But if you choose not to follow,
I would add this word right about now.
But if your knowledge is affecting somebody
but
else,
if you don't have the love, but if you don't have the love for your neighbor or your brother,
Mhm.
you're sinning against God.
There it is.
What is that, the overriding objective for all of Corinthians?
Well, you are sitting.
We get a lot of knowledge in there.
Yeah.
Oh, like every letter or every page of his letter. But this is the objective.
I like that sentence. I like that sentence. Don't let knowledge, I like the other ones written in here, don't let knowledge be a stumbling block to a weak brother. The knowledgeable brother is to act in love toward the one who has a conscience that might be weak. Believers can't let knowledge ruin a weak brother's conscience.
Amen.
It's really interesting to think about
Uh-huh.
where Paul comes from and
Yes.
the knowledge that he had.
Yes,
And yet he knew nothing about it.
that's a beautiful point. So think about Paul himself.
And
When he was a Jew, king of knowledge, had what? The Old Testament memorized, right? Rising star, he says, faster than anybody else at his time. That man operated on knowledge, right? But he had zero love. And that led him to kill Christians. And when God finally corrected him, he's now willing to say, I'll give up knowledge if it helps a brother not become defiled. So this has to do with food, food sacrificed to idols. We don't really have that here, do we? I mean, yes, okay, we do have some idols in the town, but I'm not sure that's the big number one issue in church. What is it? Where does this apply to us?
When we go to a bar with our friends.
Maybe.
And our friend drinks a lot, and we have one glass of wine, but we know there's a Christian in there, or a new Christian, and I'm a Christian, so I can drink. Well, I love to drink, so he drinks to excess every time. You're causing him to stumble.
That can be. So alcohol, I mean, I grew up in time, maybe a lot of you did too, but Christians just didn't drink, period. Am I just the only one? I mean, that's where I grew up, like, that you knew someone was a Christian. I have to say, like, when I was a kid, when I found out, like, people drank, I was like, oh, you're not a Christian. I just grew up in that tradition, right? Now, as I've gotten older, I think I've gotten more knowledge, and I'm like, okay, my salvation doesn't depend on this. However, how often do I take for granted that because I'm comfortable with opening a bottle of wine with friends, might I have a new Christian, or not even a new Christian, someone who just doesn't have peace in that area, right? Maybe has a lot more of a story around alcohol in their home, and if I were to drink, that would not be beneficial for them. So am I willing to say, I won't offer wine to this friend, I won't have it at a party in my house of so-and-so? That's an easy one. What else, Lindy?
Well, you mentioned the word hypocrisy a while ago.
Yeah,
And I think there are a lot of things that our behavior may appear to be two things, and yet if your motivation for behaving, like if your motivation for not drinking with this friend or having wine with this friend,
right,
you know, some could say, well, that's hypocritical.
you're right.
But in that, we need to express the love. We need to make that understood. And even if I'm looking at someone in the church and saying, we're really consistent with that, you know, I would do better to ask them why than to just write them off as hypocritical.
Yes.
Because Paul's not, you know, in other crowds, Paul probably ate meat just fine.
Right.
You know, I mean, pretty much says so.
But I also saw him willing to do, again, 13. Listen to how final his decision is. If food causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again. Do you see Paul's willingness, if need be, to completely give up something he felt free to do and probably enjoyed? So maybe this isn't just, I don't have wine when a certain friend comes over. Am I willing, if God so revealed to me that I need to never touch alcohol the rest of my life, am I willing? Or am I going to hold on to my freedom arrogantly, right, and hurt others? I mean, I have to have that moment. And I think Paul's expressing, I'm willing to do that. I don't think he had to do that. I think there were times he went to cities and places, and maybe we're going to see that in the next chapter, changed his behavior. But am I willing? Are you willing? Are we as a church willing to say, yeah, we feel fine doing this thing, but we'll give it up because this group of people or that person doesn't have peace with it? Where else can you think this applies? It's a tough one. It's a deep one. Because you know why? He's talking to the strong brothers.
I think it's to every facet of our life.
Yeah.
It's not to anything, it's to every facet of our life. If our freedom is causing us or someone else in any situation to pull back somebody from going to God, then we better be willing.
And we live in a really hypercritical world.
Yes, we do.
That's all we're saying.
Cancel culture and everything, right? And we need to be a place that's the opposite. Say, come on in, bring your baggage here. We'll work together. We won't force you to be where we are immediately. We will meet you. If we consider ourselves the stronger brothers, we will meet you in order to bring you to Christ. That's what chapter 9 is going to say. He's going to say, I have freedoms, but I will give that up just so some come to Christ. Not even if the payoff's huge, just if some. I don't think this way often enough. And to your point, Lindy, I think it requires a lot of communication about us, from us. do we even know the things that other people struggle with? Yeah, Kathy.
For example,
Yes.
this past weekend, I was at a conference with my mom at Kidsville, which was a great conference, but mom cannot have leadership.
Mhm.
So it was very difficult for her, and not having it, I can have it, but I didn't eat it because I didn't want to, what's the word? I didn't want my mom to feel like, well, if you can have it, then this little bit is not gonna hurt me if I just eat a little bit. So I mean, they had fabulous food, fabulous rolls, I'm going like, oh. But I didn't eat it, which helped my mom stay on what she couldn't have. So, it's kind of, you kind of have to,
You were over here.
right.
You knew what you could have, but you loved your mom so much, right? And
I knew what it was gonna do if she ate the wheat and the pasta and all of that stuff.
And it might not have been a salvation issue, but that is definitely a comfort, and does she feel accepted and loved, right? So again, that's why I started with the contrast between knowledge and love. And both motivate us. And Paul is saying in a church, we need to lean toward that love more often than toward that knowledge. Particularly if you are the stronger brother or sister, particularly. Lindy.
I just can't get this off my mind. A few weeks ago, we had people here to teach about Hindu, people of Hindu faith. And I don't know if anybody else was there, but one statement that they made, they talked about how with Hindus, you really just have to get to know them, you have to kind of be in their life, you can't just present the gospel and they're going to leave behind something that's so ancient and so ingrained. And so they talked about, you may go to a festival with someone or whatever, and from the congregation was a question, what are the spiritual ramifications sort of going into that kind of situation. And he made a comment that was so interesting to me. He said, you cannot worship accidentally. Which that has just rung in my head. In other words, if you go to a Holi celebration and throw color over each other, and you kind of get into their world, and you speak Jesus into that, he talked about how Hindus usually come very gradually to know Christ, and then to kind of gradually leave the other things behind it. It's a contrast to Sue Brady. It's rarely just a gospel presentation, here they are. It was a lot of food for thought, just right here, he was talking about, because there's so many moving here we have to know. And we even visited, a group of us visited Hindu temple, and, somewhat uneasy about just living in that environment, but it's like, if you walk in there and you know that Bible is nothing, you're not going to be accidentally worshiping it just by being there. But if you later, Ellen Childers talked about a store clerk, and she had been to that temple, and she just was so amazing that we cared enough to check it out. So there are just things that we may have to do that we're not comfortable with, but there's what was. Name the name of Jesus, let them come to it however gradually they need to. So there could be a lot of points in there where you can judge and say, well, that just didn't take us,
Right.
Because then they'll later reach a point, I think, where they're ready to start.
So that's why I think it's important to take this chapter, to your point, Lindy. Paul was talking to the church in Corinth in that time. He's not creating rules for the church from 60, 70 AD all on. This truth here is the enduring truth, right? It's expressed in this church, in the church in Corinth, by people being willing to not eat meat sacrificed to idols. To your point, might it be expressed in our church in our day by willingness to sit down with someone from a different faith and say, tell me about it, knowing that it will not defile you. Maybe that's how it's expressed here. There's a lot of ways that truth might be expressed, but we need to keep our eyes on this is the truth. Knowledge puffs up, knowledge can become arrogant, and there is a time and a place, and more often we need to operate from love if your knowledge is secure, right? And it requires, to your point, a ton of communication. and prayer and thoughtfulness on our behalf. But also the willingness for us to give up or maybe make ourselves uncomfortable for someone else. And that's chapter 9 in a really big way. Paul's going to show how that plays out. Okay, any other thoughts from chapter 8?
I really appreciate you saying that.
Okay.
Because you were expressing the way I feel, that it's not just meat or what you eat, but it's about what builds us in Christ.
Well, it's about how do we as a community of faith honor where one another where we all are in our faith journey. And to consider how my behavior affects somebody else. And to be willing to be like Christ, right? To give up our rights just so someone else can come closer to Christ. It's about that. Let's go to Romans 14. It's a lot, but I think we have time. Okay, you were supposed to have read all of Romans 14 into Romans 15. I'm not going to do that right now, but another writing of Paul's, right, to another church, very mixed, coming from Jew, coming from Gentile, a new church, having similar issues. Not the exact same, but similar issues. Listen to Paul's guiding principles. I'm just going to read a few select verses around it, and we're going to listen for the guiding principles and see where that lands us. So I am going to start in verse 1. He says, now accept the one who is weak in faith, or weak in conscience would be the 1 Corinthians 8, right? But not for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions. One man has faith that he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats what only? Vegetables, bless their heart. Verse 3, I'm just kidding. Let not him who eats regard with contempt him who does not eat, and let not him who does not eat judge him who eats. For God has accepted him. Who are you to judge the servant of another? To his own master he stands or falls, and stand he wills, for the Lord is able to make him stand. One man regards one day above another, another regards every day alike. Let each man be fully convinced in his own mind. Okay, what's going on in this body? Eating too, right? But what else? I just read in verse 5, yeah.
Which day is the day of worship?
Right. So can't you just hear the Jews go, Saturday? And the Gentiles like, I have to work on Saturday. It needs to be Sunday, right? Right? Or, or we need to observe all the feasts all these days. And the Gentiles are like, what are you talking about? Okay, so he's saying difference of opinions. So he's saying honor one another, but he brings in something that we didn't see in 1 Corinthians 8. He says, when you have a difference, don't do what? Don't judge. Don't have contempt. Don't walk around and go, see what a freak these people are? They don't know anything. How come they haven't gone further in their faith? Why are they so weak? They're ruining everything I want to do. Don't pass judgment. Don't put value on who they are in Christ. That's judgment. Don't put value on them. Don't say they're right or they're wrong. In fact, learn to well, I hate to use that word because liberals use it a lot, but coexist in the body, right? Okay, so that's 1 to 5. Let's keep going on. Verse 10 now, chapter 14, verse 10 says, but you, why do you judge your brother? Or again, why do you regard your brother with contempt? For we will all stand before what? He's reminding them of some knowledge they should remember. We're all going to stand. Verse 13, therefore let us not judge one another anymore, but rather determine this. This sounds familiar. Not to put an obstacle or stumbling block in a brother's way. I know and am convinced in the Lord Jesus that nothing's unclean in itself. But to him who thinks anything to be unclean, to him it is. Ooh, we need to know that. If your brother or sister in the faith says to do X, Y, or Z is sin, okay, right? To him it is sin. Like, yes, build relationship, but honor that. Why would I try to make someone do something that they think is a sin? I think sometimes the modern church wants to do that. And We just need to know. Okay. Let's keep moving on. I want to read 15. Yes. For if because of food your brothers hurt, you are no longer walking according to what? That's do not destroy with your food him for whom Christ has died. Look at verse 19. So then let us pursue the things which make for peace and the building up, the edifying of one another. Verse 21. It is good not to eat meat or to drink wine or to do anything by which your brother stumbles. The faith which you have as your own conviction before God. Happy is he who does not condemn himself in what he approves, but he who doubts is condemned if he eats, because his eating is not from faith, and whatever is not from faith is sin. What else is, how does this relate to 1 Corinthians 8? What else did you hear that relates? I hear the word pursue peace. And peace in this case is for the stronger brother to meet the younger where they're at. Right? We often operate from, I'm stronger, come up and join me. I'm stronger, live like I do. I'm stronger, do these things, because you can. And Paul's saying the opposite. That person is saying, I can't do it. Let that be. That's love.
This is one place where he's not saying imitate me.
Right? Well, he's saying imitate me in that be willing to give anything up. But right.
Take my freedom.
Yeah, listen to that nuance, right? There are times that we say, okay, if you're telling me you can't do that, I will join you there. Because I don't want you to stumble. Because, yeah, it's some pretty deep stuff. Okay, chapter 15, verses 1 to 3, last thing. Now we who are strong ought to bear the weaknesses of those without strength and not just please ourselves. Let each of us please your neighbor for his good, to his edification. For even Christ did not please himself, because he would have stayed in heaven, right? He wouldn't have died if he pleased himself, right? But as is written, the reproaches of those who reproached them fell upon me. Go to Philippians 2, 1 through 4. More writings of Paul. Very similar. Philippians 2, 1 to 4. Huh?
That was your lesson.
Yeah. Philippians 2, 1 to 4. More guiding principles, right? Listen to what they are. If therefore there is any encouragement of Christ, if there is any consolation of love, if there is any fellowship of the Spirit, and the answer to all those questions is yes, there is. If any affection and compassion, make my joy complete by being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in spirit, intent on one purpose. Sounds easy. We haven't accomplished it yet. But listen to verse 3. I think here's how you do it. Do nothing from what? Selfishness or empty conceit. Empty conceit, just knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, makes arrogant. Don't just let that be your guiding light. I'm comfortable doing it, I'm going to do it. He says don't do that, but instead do things with humility of mind, letting each of you regard one another as more important than himself. It's putting me here, however strong I think I am, wherever I think in my faith, I'm putting everybody else here. Pure and simple. Yeah, you took a deep breath. Me too, right? Now I understand why at the beginning of our lesson they're like, how much harm has been done in the church? Because we say, I'm strong. You weak people need to come join me. Why do you get this? You just beat them on the head. How come you don't know? How come you don't know, right? And instead he says, be Christ. Choose to lower yourself so that you can bring others up here. Hurts. That means there's things I may never do again in my life, and maybe there's things I am going to do, places I'm going to go, simply because I'm putting someone else above me. It means I need to talk to my Father a lot. God, not this man, but God the Father a lot about what would you have me do here? How can I honor this weaker brother or sister, right? Okay. Ouch, those are good. Now let's do 1 Corinthians 9. Y'all ready? 1 Corinthians 9, even though when I first read it, I'm like, I'm not sure how this continues the thought, but the more I studied it, the more I saw it really does continue the thought. So 1 Corinthians 9, let's read verses 1 to 7. Again, ignore that giant number 9 and the space between chapter 8 and chapter 9. I think it makes it a little easier. So I'm going to reread verse 13 because I think that makes more sense. He says, therefore, if food causes my brother to stumble, I will never eat meat again, that I might not cause my brother to stumble. Am I not free? The answer to that is yes. Am I not an apostle? Yes, you are. Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Yes, he did. Are you not my work in the Lord? Yes. If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. My defense to those who examine me is this: do we not have a right to eat and drink? The answer is yeah. Do we not have a right to take along a believing wife, even as the rest of the apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Yeah. Or do only Barnabas and I not have a right to refrain from working? Ouch. Verse 7, who at any time serves as a soldier at his own expense? Anybody? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat the fruit of it? Nobody. Or who tends a flock and does not use the milk of the flock? Okay, what's going on here? What is the issue? Paul's in a defending mode now, right? He just said, I'm willing to give up anything for my brother and sister, and now he's back to defending. He's asking a whole bunch of rhetorical questions. And I read it's getting a little personal for Paul here, right? What's he defending? What's going on? What issue is he addressing?
Being a hypocrite himself, because he is the one that they're looking to, but he's not perfect. Only Christ is perfect.
Okay, so they're looking at him. They're judging him. I'll give you that, right? They're definitely judging him. There are some questions in there, and we saw it in chapter 4, about is he really their apostle or not?
Right.
So they're doing some of that. Like, I'm not sure you weren't really awesome when you spoke, but he's like, I am an apostle. You're actually proof of it. Okay, so he's defending who he is in Christ. What else is he defending? He's bringing up some other issues.
I think
Can't we say he's saying, we as servants of the Lord have a right to live our life in freedom, the way we want to.
Yes, okay, so I think that's a good starting point. Paul is saying, I'm an apostle of Christ, you are my work, and as such, I have some rights, freedoms and liberties as well. Now, where it starts getting personal is when we get down to verse 4. He says, basic human right. I have the right to do what?
Eat and drink as I want.
What does it take to eat and drink? Money, right? Because I'm allowed to have sustenance. Just because I'm a missionary doesn't mean I need to starve. I think that's kind of what he's saying here. Okay, we agree with that. Okay,
Evangelist.
right. Evangelist he is. Okay, so verse 5. Here's another right, very specific to being an apostle. What does he say here?
I can have a wife if I want.
I can bring who? I can bring my wife, right? Right? And my wife can travel with me. Does Paul have a wife? No. If he did, he's saying, well, look at Cephas, look at these others. They get to take their wife. They get to eat and they get to drink and they get to take their wife on their journeys. Okay, he's building up, right? Verse 6. Then he asks what? This is what I said gets ouch. What do you read between the lines? What is Paul doing?
He doesn't work.
He
preaches.
That's not true. He actually,
He does.
he does work. He supports himself.
Yeah.
So he says, I have a right to eat and drink. Other missionaries take their wives and they get supported by the churches. But Barnabas and I, Paul says, we seem to be the only ones that have this other job on the side to support us. Now,
Do you think it was the other disciples that were after him?
I think that it's the churches. And I think we're going to read on. So read on. I don't think it's that this church did this to him. He's building a case. Don't leave this behind. So Paul's also saying this. Paul's also saying knowledge is, if you're a missionary or evangelist, then your work as a missionary or evangelist supports you. That's knowledge. But just because you have knowledge, do you have the right to always act that way? Right, he already said that in chapter 8. I think that's what he's getting ready to say here.
Well, he's-
I have the right to be fully supported, but I'm choosing not to. I think that's where he's landing, but he's starting to build that argument. He and Barnabas, we've read it before. When Paul goes to cities, how does he support himself? We think he's a tent maker, right? So the churches don't give him money. And as such, those churches might be looking at him and go, well, you're not a real apostle because you have another job. I think there's both going on.
Which is what he said in the very first chapter about, you're not a church of Cephas, you're not a church of
Apollos, yeah.
You're a church of all of us put together because you're on a faith journey.
Mhm.
So they may be comparing, well, Cephas
Yes.
did that, and
Yes.
so and so.
They absolutely are, and that's what he's talking to, right? They're like, Apollo spoke like this, and they're probably saying, Cephas has his wife, and the church is paying for them. You're not getting paid. Are you really an apostle?
Right.
And Paul's saying, but I am, because you're proof of that. Okay, now, why is he saying all this? We have to answer that question in a moment, right? So, verse 7, he uses an illustration, and we all said, of course, a soldier gets paid by the government, right? When you plant a vineyard, I get to eat those grapes. If I tend a flock, I get to, drink the goat milk. Oh, I hate goat milk, but I would do it if it brings a brother to Christ. But I hate it.
You would go.
Don't bring me goat milk, y'all. Do not bring me goat milk. Okay. So verses 8 to 14. Okay, so we established what Paul's doing. I think Paul is simply using his life to re-illustrate this point from chapter 8. I think that's what he's doing. I think he's showing them another way that you can have knowledge, but you need to have love for your neighbor mostly. And I think that's what he's starting to bring into play here. Okay, verses 8 to 14. I'm going to read those, and then we're going to go back through them, and we're going to look at what supports his argument. He says, I am not speaking these things according to human judgment, am I? Or does the law also say these things? It does. It addresses. The priests were supported by their churches, yes. Verse 9, it is written in the law of Moses, you will not muzzle the ox while he is threshing. God is not just concerned, wise and just. God is not concerned about oxen, is he? No, it was meant to be applied to life. Okay, or is he speaking altogether for our sake? Yes, for our sake it was written, because the plowman ought to plow in hope, and the thresher to thresh in hope of sharing the crops. If we sowed spiritual things in you, is it too much if we should reap material things from you? If others share the right over you, do we not more? Listen close. Nevertheless, we did not what is right. Remember that. We do not use this right, but we endure all things. Why? That we may cause no hindrance to the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who perform sacred services eat the food of the temple, and those who attend regularly to the altar have their share with the altar? So also the Lord directed those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the gospel. Listen again. But I have used none of these things. And listen again. I am not writing these things that it may be done so in my case. For it would be better for me to die than have any man make my boast an empty one. Ooh, okay. Paul uses, so he's already said, knowledge. He says the Old Testament says what? What is the knowledge about supporting your ministers in the Old Testament?
The temple should be support.
And he says the picture of an oxen, don't muzzle him. He's like, God spoke to this truth often. That whatever work you do, the hope is the work you do is the thing that supports you. He's saying that is knowledge. Okay, so keep that in mind. So he's continuing to build that up. Verse 14. So he says, if you are a minister of the gospel, the Lord said you should get your living from. All right, that's why we pay our pastors, y'all. Okay, verse 15. Did Paul exercise those rights? I can have rights and not exercise them. I can choose to not vote, right? There's a lot of, I can choose not to have a driver's license. Right? I can turn down Social Security at some point. Like, I have a lot of rights that I can give up. This is a right that Paul just developed and says, I chose to give it up. Now the question is, why on earth would Paul make his life what appears to be more difficult by not taking a paycheck from the church? He tells us. Why? It's more than he's moving on. Verse 12. Read the end of verse 12. End of verse 12. There's his why. Well,
Want to.
Well, and so that's my question, Mom. Why doesn't he want to? He has a really good answer.
Free of charge, he doesn't want to.
He wants to make it free of charge. The question again is why? Why? He says it. To cause no hindrance to the gospel. How might Paul taking a paycheck hinder the gospel?
People won't go to church because they don't like the offering.
Why else?
He just wants to do it wherever he goes. He's got
Do you
it.
think that money needed to go somewhere else?
Yes.
To help others or?
What do they
I don't think that's it. I don't think that's it here.
Judas, why didn't you use that money on the board instead of, giving it, I mean, they could say to Paul, you're using your money in the wrong way.
So look at verse 15. I know the language is a little difficult, but I think there's another hint in verse 15. I've used none of these things. In other words, I'm not taking my paycheck. I'm not writing these things that it may be done. In other words, he's like, hold on, I'm not being manipulative even by talking this. He's like, don't start sending me a paycheck just because I wrote about it. That's not my purpose. He says, it would be better for me to die than have any man make my boast an empty one. Let's stop boasting. What does Paul say he's going to boast in? The Lord.
The gospel.
And
He doesn't need the money.
and the people that he brings to Christ. Okay, keep that in mind. Verse 16. For if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for I am under compulsion. For woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. What does he say about him preaching the gospel there?
It's the same like if he takes the money, that he didn't preach it.
Thank you.
He's doing
Yes.
it. He's
Yes.
doing it on his own.
Yes. He says not taking the paycheck for this body of believers proves that the only reason he's doing it is because God told him. If he came and preached the gospel, he feels like, and the church handed him a paycheck, that church that already was critical of him could say, the only reason you're doing this is for the paycheck.
Yep.
And he's saying the only reward I need is their faith. I don't want the money as a reward. I have the right to the money, and it doesn't mean the church should never pay a minister. This has been taken that way. It's not about that. That's why I said these two chapters are about this church in Corinth. This is the stuff we got to remember right here. And we got to remember this. Paul gave up his right. And we have to say why. So there would be no hindrance to the gospel. That is love. That is when he says, I'm going to take knowledge, I'm going to put it away, and I'm going to act in love. The loving thing is to not take a paycheck from this church. The loving thing is for me to work on my own to support myself because I don't want there would be no hindrance to the gospel. That might still be true in some contexts. There might be places in the world where that is true, where the pastor probably because of social norms, wherever he's at, shouldn't take a paycheck from his congregation. There are probably places where the church had better take a paycheck from his congregation or they would be offended. You need to know which. And Paul is saying the wisdom and true love is knowing the difference. And it's knowing that just because I have rights, I'm not going to necessarily exercise them. Because it's about the gospel. So that's where he's going with his argument. Verse 12, let's go. We looked at verse 12, right? Are we down to, we did verse 15, right? We did verse 16. He's not taking a paycheck for them. Okay, let's look at verse, where do I want to go? 17 to 23. 17 to 23. He said, for if I do this, okay, the this in that verse, it took me a while. I had to study this a bunch before I figured it out. The this in this verse, I think, is not receiving money for his ministry. It says, for if I don't receive money for my ministry voluntarily, he chooses to say no to the paycheck. He says, I have a reward. I'm still going to get rewarded, right? But if it's against my will, in other words, if you guys refused it, I have a stewardship entrusted to me. He said, what then is my reward? And we kind of talked about this a moment ago. That when I preach the gospel, I may offer the gospel without charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. He wants to offer the gospel without charge. That's on his heart right now. Verse 19, for though I am free from all men, I have freedom, I have liberty, right? I have made myself a slave to all so that I might what? Win more. Now listen to these examples, right? Verse 20. To the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win the Jews. To those who are under the law as under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I may by all means save some. And I do all things for the sake of the gospel, that I may become a fellow partaker of it. Okay, what is Paul's calling? Without a doubt, when you think back on Paul, he's laser focused. What's his calling? Whatever it takes. Whatever it takes. To what point? How far does this man go to preach the gospel?
Give it up right.
Give it up rights. And sometimes taking on difficult things. Can you imagine if you and I, like someone came in and said, I want for you to follow the Old Testament law and live like a Jew for the next year. A Hasidic Jew, no less. Yeah, we're all like, oh no. I watched a few shows about that. But what does Paul say? When he hangs out with the Jews and he's, I'll take it on. I know his knowledge says, I'm not under the law. That, like to Lindy's point, I'm not like accidentally, my faith and my truth hasn't changed. I'm just acting a certain way. Why? I want just some of them to come to Christ. Now, then he goes, when I go to Gentile, when I go to Corinth, that's all about anything goes, how does he live there? Does he sin? No, he says, though not being without the law of God, like still, there are things he will not do, but he's not going to look like a Jew when he goes and ministers to the Gentiles. When you and I go to other cultural contexts, we often will do things, right? Go to Nepal, I don't wear pants. I wear a skirt. Because if I wore pants, the women would look at me like, right? That's just a simple one, but Paul would do that and more. Okay, right? So he says to those without law, 22, to the weak he does what? I became weak. So that's the law. I'm not going to eat meat. Fine, I'll eat vegetables. Like, I'm not going to do things. I become all things to all men, but I may by all means save some. And I do all things for the sake of the gospel, that I may become a fellow partaker of it. His reward is watching others come to Christ. Right. He's so laser focused on that, and he has strategies. And so we have to ask ourselves, 2022, what does that look like? I'm not sure I have a quick answer. Right? But anyways, okay, let's look at 20. Go ahead. Do you have an answer?
I'm going to be partial.
Okay.
I think Paul is telling us this is how I must live in Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in 2020, each one of us must then make the decision how we live in Christ.
I think that's a great starting point, right? You're right. Because he's like, I know this is my call. And he knows there are some guiding principles that we could all apply also. But you're right. What does it look like for Dan or Sharon or Anna or Lindy or Nalita? What does it look like for you to enter other people's lives and share the gospel? What rights might we need to give up, right? How much like them do we become? How do we keep that line of, I represent Christ, but I also love this human being? That takes a lot of prayer, right?
Let me give you a story about this.
Do it.
challenged a fellow Christian. We were in a session one night, international people, he's from Indiana. He made the comment about the poverty and so forth in the world, and he lived in northern Indianapolis where that didn't exist. I said, I'm sorry to tell you that it lives in your community. I told him later, I apologize for judging him or
Singling him out, maybe.
Yes, but again, he was looking in the context of, I have a great life, and you overseas don't have it, so I'm going to help you. And right in his back door, he could have probably helped people, but he was blinded to that fact.
Good point. And so I think what I hear you also saying is, we have a ministry wherever we are at, and
Yes.
Paul recognized that. Whatever city he was at, there were people that needed Christ, and he was going to become who he needed to be for them. Willing to give up rights, willing to say, I know this, but instead I'm going to act in love. And in 1 Corinthians 13 is all about showing the better way, and that's the way of love, right? And moving forward in that. Let's look at 24 to 27. You are going to look at this some more next week, so we are not going to do an exhaustive study of 24 to 27. We're going to kind of go over it pretty quick because you're going to look at it more next week. But the context of these verses is still Paul saying, I'm willing to give up rights. I'm willing to walk in love in order to bring people to the gospel. So he says, verse 24, he's going to bring up some more illustration. Do you not know that those who run in a race, competitively, right, all run, but only how many wins the prize? One. Run in such a way that you win. And everyone who competes in the games exercises self-control in all things. They then do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we do it to receive an imperishable wreath. Therefore, I run in such a way as not without aim. I love that. He's very intentional, right? I box in such a way, not as beating the air. He knows who his enemy is. I buffet my body and make it my slave, lest possibly after I have preached to others, I myself should be disqualified. Okay, so the context is him, what he's willing to do for the gospel, right? What picture is he painting? How does he do this? How did Paul accomplish this? He kind of gives us a little picture of his brain. How did he think about himself?
Just like everyone else around me.
Uh-huh.
Fit in to be able to present the gospel to them.
Right, and then in verse 24 to 27 is kind of about that. To me, maybe some of the prep work behind the scenes. How does he think about himself? How does he think about himself? He gives you several illustrations. As a what? One of those illustrations, he thinks of himself as a competitive runner. And a competitive runner is only in it to win. So he says, I think about it. What do I need to do to win? Winning for Paul would be what? Someone coming to the gospel. He's like, I'm not just going to run. Maybe I'll come in 50th place. He's like, I want that person coming to the gospel. Okay, so he says that. Everyone who competes in the games, right? They'll exercise self-control. Give up a right. Say no to some things. Say yes to some things in measured amounts. Why? Because they want that prize. Okay, I run in such a way, not without aim. I know what my goal is. I box in such a way. Now here we go, verse 27. You looked up these two words, right? The first one was, but I buffet my body. The other word for that is what? Discipline. I do like Buffett. Not Jimmy Buffett. I mean, he's okay. He's okay. I think. But he says, I discipline or I buffet my body. What does that word mean? Did y'all look that up? Do you remember? Because it's kind of shocking. It means, ready?
What?
The word discipline or buffet, 27. 27. No. It's not a buffet. It's not a buffet.
That's like a hyacinth bouquet or a hyacinth bucket.
So it means to literally strike yourself under the eyes, beat the face black and blue, give a black eye. Buffet or discipline. Paul said that. Oh, look it up. Look it up. It's hupopiazo.
I don't have the very
Woo!
first definition.
It, say again, Lindy. Lindy's fact checking because some of y'all weren't believing me.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Lindy.
The very first definition, to beat black and blue, to smite so as to cause bruises and livid spots.
Discipline. To strike as to cause spots.
Livid.
And discipline is in the present tense, which means it's a continuous action, which means now, which doesn't mean back then, which means continuous. Okay, I know. We're all like, we're not into self-beating, right?
That's right.
We're not into self-abuse. But what is he saying? Keep it in context. I give up my rights so I don't hinder the gospel. Might I do some things that cause pain to myself?
If we're practicing boxing, you're probably.
Well, no, like literally. There are things in my life I love to do. Am I willing to give them up for the gospel? Think about it. You're from the U.S. You grow up here. You have a kid. Let's raise up the ante a little bit. You have a child you raised here. They come and say, I'm going to go live in Afghanistan to spread the gospel. That's a bruise to me. That would be painful if Anna and Ian said, I'm going to go put myself in harm's way. That hurts. I'm giving something up for the gospel. That's just a little picture. Might there be other things I'm called to do? I think of Chiv and Emra going back to their homeland that caused them pain in order to spread the gospel. Learn another language, learn another culture that might actually be hard or uncomfortable. That's what he's talking about. I am willing to do things that cause pain and discomfort to myself because I know the end goal is to win one. He's that serious. But you know what? I think this is for all of us too, right? Because he's giving this to the church. In chapter 8, he said, you might not be a missionary church, but I'm asking you, church, are you willing to cause yourself pain or discomfort in order to not hurt a weaker brother? Just like I, Paul, don't take a paycheck and change who I am in some ways to bring others. That's what he's talking about. So that's discipline. He says, I buffet, I discipline my body, I make it my slave. I like this. For Paul, his body was the servant and the inner man was the master. My body does not rule me. My inner man, my life of Christ, rules what happens with my body. We Americans live the opposite. We say, my body wants this. And so it's going to affect my inner man. My body wants me to do this.
And you're supposed to do what you feel like.
Right. And be who you think your body wants you to be. And Christ is the opposite. My inner man, my truth with God, rules my body. And that's what Paul is saying. And I'm willing to go through some discomfort. He says, lest possibly on the other side, if I don't do this, if I'm not willing to do these things, after I've preached to others, I can be a preacher, I myself should be what? Which is disapproved. Which is you don't measure up. Which is also literally, it's failing to meet the test. Kind of like that test of metal and coins they did back then. Is it pure? And he's like, if I'm not willing to do these things, I have to ask myself, I could still be preaching the gospel, but get to heaven and God's like, oh, he missed. I don't know if he's talking about his salvation there, but I think he is talking about he knows that he's going to answer to God in the end. And what does he need to be willing to do? So, if we let ourselves, right, think about these things, this is not an easy 2 chapters. And I think that's why we have found the church has not done a lot with it. Because it's hard. It's about personal sacrifice, probably, and pain some. So, questions. What does this mean for you and I? What's the overall truth in 1 Corinthians 8 and 9? We've written a lot of it up on the board. But I would say, so moving back, to 1 Corinthians 7 about, the questions about marriage, divorce, and all, we said the central truth in that was, Paul was saying, stay as you are, if at all possible, right? He was saying that. Now, we're getting to 1 Corinthians 8 and 9. If you were to say, what is the truth of these two, what's he saying here? Totally different topic. What's he saying? Use the board, cheat. It's up there. It's kind of up there. What? You must have knowledge and love, but which is more important? Let love reign. Right? I think that's a good one. Knowledge is good, but let love reign, because knowledge comes up. I think, another truth would be, are we willing to give rights up to bring others to Christ? It's a truth.
Something may be permissible, but not necessarily proper.
Yes, we've seen that a lot in Scripture too, right? Now we're understanding that a little more, right? When I go back and read those words that, everything might be permissible, but not everything is beneficial. Now studying this, that makes a little more sense, right? I think those are all the guiding truths. It's not about whether you eat or not eat. It's not about whether your pastor takes a paycheck. It's about those deeper things. Okay, so the question for you and I leaving is then, how can we practice these principles? Again, it's not about coming up with a list of rules for the church in 2020. It's about what's ruling in here as I carry out my calling in Christ. I think that's what it's more about. And that takes more of a one-on-one conversation with you and God, right? Wherever you are at. All right, thoughts, questions, comments?
That makes it a very possible thing.
Awful.
Awful.
You are absolutely right. Crystal just said it makes the prosperity gospel thing awful. It really does. It is so self-centered. It takes it and you're like, no. It's all about other people are way more important than me. It's not about me being comfortable and happy and doing whatever I want. It's about other people.
It's just such an everyday message.
Yes. It requires a lot more community that I think sometimes we're willing to live in. Yeah. That was my thought. I'm like, do we even know the things that cause our brothers and sisters in our body to stumble? Do we know them well enough? I mean, that was what I kept thinking about.
Are we listening?
Are we listening? Right. Requires a lot more talking and listening than I think we do. We just want to shout people knowledge. Here's knowledge. Right. Okay.
But buffeting your body,
Yes.
that's not to get more points with God.
No.
That is so that you can be where other people are and be able to help them. It's all about loving Him.
Yeah.
And not loving yourself more than them.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely.
There's many religious, the more I love myself and wear raspy clothes.
Right. And like I said, it is
more
also
points for heaven.
it is also interesting to read these chapters and go, I see where other denominations have taken little parts of this totally out of context. And yes, I mean, because there are, again, a lot in the Catholic Church where they literally beat themselves to make themselves more holy. That's what I say. But if you take stuff out of context, you can land there, which is why I love precepts, because we learn not to do that. And it's a good life skill. All right, go get yourself some more food, and we will